My name is Ryan. I'm one of the events hosts here at McNally Jackson. Thank you so much for this wonderful special event on this very nice day. Surprisingly, like a nice spring day. Good day for authors. But before we get started, I just wanted a quick few announcements. If you bought a ticket for today, either through a voucher or a book, if you bought a ticket with the voucher, you can use it only today. So start thinking about what you want to buy. You can buy the authors a book. You could buy the authors a drink. You could buy anyone any sort of thing. And the bar is going to be open until 9 p.m. So you can redeem the vouchers downstairs. And also there's going to be a signing that's going to be right up here. So we're going to make a nice little orderly line like we always do. And finally, there's going to be a quick Q&A in the last 10-15 minutes. So start thinking of your questions now. But without further ado, I'm going to be introducing the two amazing authors. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Now to get out of frame. The first author in conversation is the title for Commitment. Mona Simpson is the author of Anywhere But Here, Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, and Casebook. She has received a Whitney Award, Writers Award, a Hodder Fellowship at Princeton, an NEA Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Grant, a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Mary McCarthy Prize. Off Keck Road was a finalist for Penn Faulkner Award and won a Heartland Prize from the Chicago Tribune. This is amazing lineup. Wow, I'm like reading this and I'm she was recently elected to the American Academy of the Arts and Letters and is the publisher of the Paris Review, where she worked as an editor in her 20s. She lives in Santa Monica, California, where she's on the faculty at UCLA, where she often teaches Middlemarch. Wow. Okay. What a lineup. Sorry, not to embarrass you now. I read your books, but I didn't. Okay, so amazing. In conversation is the lovely Tara Westover. Tara is an American author, raised in Idaho by a father who opposed public education. She never attended school. She spent her days working in her family's junkyard or stewing herbs for her mother. A self-taught herbalist and midwife, she was 17 the first time she set foot inside a classroom. After that, she pursued learning for a decade, graduating magna cum laude from Brigham University, Young University, say it 3 times fast, and subsequently winning the Gates Cambridge Scholarship. In 2014, she earned a PhD in history from Trinity College, Cambridge. Westover was the fall 2019 A.M. Rosenthal Writer in Residence at the Shorstein Center at Harvard Kennedy School. Educated is her first book. So thank you both so much, and thank you for coming. I think I'm going to hand it off to Tara first. And, okay, yeah. Just kind of.
Testing?
Perfect.
All right. Can you guys see us? Is it? I'm noticing we have seats that go over there. And I'm wondering, would it be helpful, Mona, if we move our chair?
I would move forward, yeah.
Yeah, let's move it forward a little bit.
I think that sounds good. I'm just noticing I can't see people, so I assume they can't see me.
Start out also by saying that Tara just returned from the White House where she received from President Biden the Medal for the Arts. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mona, I appreciate that. You were feeling envious as you read off all and you were turning red. You thought you'd try to make me red too.
No, I was almost going to read. I had read. I was lucky enough to read Educated in manuscript, and I remember giving a look at the book. You'd said so many of the things that happen in the book, but what you didn't mention is the writing, which is fantastic.
Well, thank you. I can see this trick. You're trying to make this you interviewing me, but it's not going to work. I'm on to you already, but I appreciate it. But we are here to talk about your book, so I'm going to interview you. And tell us about the germ of this book. Where did the idea for this book, when did it begin, and how did you come to write it?
You know, it's funny. I said to someone that this book had taken 6 years, and that seemed like a long time, and then I actually looked it up, and it took 9 years, so that's a horrible fact. But I think it started the way most of my books start, with little, corner notes. And I started writing about a young man in college who seemed apparently, to be enjoying the normal college things. He became friends with his roommate, because being exuberant and being away from home and making friends. And he sort of fell in love with two girls down the hall, sort of a pair of them, although one of whom he thought about in a more erotic way, pictured her naked before bed. But at the same time, he had concerns about back home, about his family back home. He left his single mom with two siblings. And that's sort of where I started. And then I think I read an essay by Oliver Sacks, the late great Oliver Sacks, called "The Lost Virtues of the Asylum." And I, like everybody in my generation, sort of assumed I had the typical view of state mental health institutions as kind of snake pits, much like Cuckoo's Nest and so forth. And I read this piece, and he sort of traced the history of mental health hospitals in America. And I came to wonder what that would be like. So those two stories, or those two things converged. He actually traced the idealistic history of how they started, but he also mentioned, he quoted from memoirs of people who've been in institutions and found great solace from the safety of a smaller, safer world. And he remembered patients having good experiences, and he worked recently, until his death. He worked for 25 years at Vernon State Hospital. So he knew what he was talking about. So that's where I started.
One of the things about your writing, and especially in this book, that I admire is you're very astute in the way you make observations about class. And there's just a level of specificity about it. I mean, I was thinking about, early on in this book, we find out that these three siblings have attended this school illegally. They've used a false address. So they wanted to attend, their mother wanted them to attend a better school. And I think there's a way where you kind of say that and leave it there, but that becomes such a recurring theme in the story, all the different ways that impacted their lives, that unless you've experienced it, it'd be hard to kind of imagine. Like, they have never had a friend over to their house. The daughter is always, awkwardly has to make excuses when she's offered a ride home late at night, and there's no obvious reason why the father of her friend can't drive her home, but she has to come up with these elaborate reasons why he can't, because he can't see where she lives. And I just thought that, I wondered if you just had some comment on that, and how you get this idea, and then how you manage to unfurl it in this very complicated but very natural way into the story.
It's funny, a friend of mine, speaking of class in the novel, a friend of mine read the book in manuscript and said, gosh, these kids, education is really kind of a big deal to these people. It was very important to them. And I realized just how far I have come, culturally, and what a different world I'm living in, because in the world I grew up in, at least until I was 12, I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, in a sort of lower middle class neighborhood. My mom had been the first person to go to college, but she came back home, and everyone there understood. I mean, it was just, everyone understood that the way to, the mythology at least was that the way to get out of that particular life and into a better life was through college. And yet, at the same time, even though everyone knew that, around about the time people got to high school, it was very hard to actually do that, because it was so seductive and so absolutely tantalizing when you could get a job and get actual money. So that happened, at least in this book with Lena, one of my three kids. The mother has a breakdown. The mother wants her kids to have a better life and strives and strives and strives and gets her son to college, but then really has a break and is committed to a state mental health hospital. And that leaves her two of her children at home. The oldest is already at college. And so, I mean, the one who's still at home does a sort of wild thing. She wants to go back east, even though there's not the money. It's very unrealistic at this point. Her mother's in a state hospital. But she applies to just a couple schools and no safety schools, and then doesn't get in. So she gets work at a department store. And what do you know, she's kind of good at it. she's artistically inclined, that's what she's interested in, and she sort of apprentices herself to the person who does the displays and finds she can actually get some traction there. So it's a real seduction.
And I've also was noticing as I was reading the period details of just, this is a story that is set in a specific moment, and I was remembering that there's a moment where they're talking about the son is going to call Walter. He's going to call, but he's going to call on Sunday.
Because the rates are lower.
Because the rates are lower, the long distance, and I was vaguely remembering
Thing
that.
of the past.
Like some of the people here are like, what are you even talking about? But it's a very specific thing. Like, oh, it's the rates are just cheaper. You pay less when you call telephone long distance on Sunday. And I just thought, how when you're setting a story like this in a time that, I mean, you may remember, but it isn't now. How much of that? I don't know. I just wonder, how do you go about setting it in that place? Do you add that later? Is it through feedback? Does that come organically? Tell me about that process.
I wanted it to be exactly kind of that moment in time, because I was, in the back of my mind, I was really thinking about this book in terms of kind of a social safety net. I mean, when I was growing up, I grew up in this middle-sized city, and there was an orphanage, and everyone knew where the orphanage was. There wasn't a mental health hospital, but if there had been, everyone would have known that that was that. And all those institutions, basically, all those things we grew up with, which were vast safety nets, they pretty much emptied out in the 70s and 80s. Gradually, I mean, things don't happen all overnight. But so I wanted it to be sort of at the last moment where someone could feasibly go without being incarcerated to a state mental health institution, and possibly have it be a mixed experience, not a disaster. And so that was the moment, and then it was fun, you know. Then I was listening to a lot of records that I still had, or that I remembered from that time a little bit, and you know, it's really fun to go and look at the clothes and just look at what happened every year in those times. It's kind of great.
You were going to do a reading for us. Did you want to do it now, or do you want to do it at the end?
And whenever.
I think
Should I
so.
read a
Let's
little
have a
bit?
reading.
Sure.
Let's distribute it throughout.
Okay, I'm not going to read a whole lot. Glasses.
Very cool glasses.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the very beginning, when one of my three protagonists first goes to school, and then I'll read a little bit from about a year later. Walter hadn't had a real friend before. He'd walked with certain guys through the halls of Pally High. He'd called them friends, but not one of them had ever seen his house, because he and his sister attended their high school illegally. Years ago, their mom had driven to Pacific Palisades from the valley to do their wash Sunday mornings at a high-ceilinged, mostly empty laundromat that played the classical music station. The Korean owners liked the children who folded their own clothes, and told Walter's mom about the lottery system that had allowed their own kids, now both UCLA graduates, into the Palisades district. She tried the lottery, failed twice, and finally smuggled them in using the address of a woman she met at an exercise class, who eventually stopped returning their calls. The woman must have still received mail from the high school. She could have turned them in. They'd had to lie low. Walter had complained about never being able to accept a ride home, and his mom admitted the difficulty, calling it a trade-off. But Walter was legitimate here. He'd come to Berkeley the usual way, with better grades than the others from Pally. Every Sunday, his roommate Ken wrote a letter to his parents that began, "Dear Father and Mother." Walter wasn't in the habit of writing letters, but he tried one. "I made a friend," he wrote. "We eat together every meal." His mother would be glad to know. He scribbled a P.S. for his sister. "Carrie Appel, remember her, the goddess? Guess who she rooms with?" The goddess from Pally High, who'd once come to school in a see-through gauze dress, a pile of hair pinned on top of her head, now shared a room with the average 18-year-old who'd worked on the decorations committee for dances Walter didn't attend, Susan. His sister Lena would know them both. She studied girls at Pally the way some guys watch the field during a game and play. while they followed Susan's family's station wagon up the length of the state. Lena said she couldn't imagine Walter dating Susan, which was a preposterous thing to say. Walter didn't plan to date anyone. Date is a ridiculous word, more suitable for the edible sugary fruit. The goddess was a goddess. He was a virgin, but that didn't top his list of concerns. Ken was too, Walter could tell. At night in their beds, the two young men talked. Ken had grown up in the Central Valley. His parents were immigrants, both doctors, but not rich, not like the American doctors here, he said. They thought he should become a doctor too. Ken's birthday was February 24, the number picked first in the original lottery. Since President Nixon abolished deferment, students were classified available for service, just like the rest of the American male population. They couldn't draft you, though, until you were 20. Walter had never worried about being drafted. No one he knew in high school worried personally either, though student deferment had been a topic in his civics class. Once, his mom talked to someone from where she'd grown up and afterwards shook her head. Another boy overseas. I did the right thing getting you here. She believed the world worked differently for the prosperous, keeping them from danger. Now, listening, Walter questioned her assumption that graduating among them would extend him protections. Safety might require more direct payment. Otherwise, why wouldn't Ken be vulnerable? Does it matter to you, being Chinese? He asked. I don't know. I've never not been. Ken didn't speak any Chinese language, but he'd gone to China school Saturday mornings and understood a little Mandarin. Does it matter to you, not being anything? I guess like you, I've always been. Walter often paused at Susan and Carrie's doorway. He loved their room. Each of the dorm rooms had come with metal bed frames, metal wastebaskets, and plywood desks. Walter and Ken's remained exactly as they'd found it, but these two had set their beds at a 90-degree angle, so their heads nearly touched while they slept. They had a small, portable television with an antenna. Walter hadn't been friends with them at Pally. Friendship was his great discovery in college, more important than classes and than the job he'd found manning a food cart. When they say co-ed dorm, he wrote home, they mean it, even the bathrooms. I never see girls in there. They must shower at midnight. He avoided the co-ed bathrooms too. When he could, he used restrooms on campus, which were still labeled men and women. As Walter stood, watching Nixon announce his electoral victory, Susan shook her head. It's not right. Walter assumed she meant Nixon. 9 days late. My allowance, Carrie explained. My dad forgot to send the check. Allowance, wow. That money should be here on the 1st, Susan said, like clockwork. You need some dough? Walter had money from his job, but the young women began a chorus of no thank yous, and it suddenly occurred to him that his offer felt dishonest. He didn't want to appear, as he must have at Pally, richer than he was. His mom was ashamed of their relative poverty. At Berkeley, he was awakening to the possibility of being unashamed. Clarity, he thought, made friendship possible. I don't get allowance, but I work for the food service, so I've got some dough. He tossed 2 20s onto Carrie's bed. The goddess looked at him wet-eyed as she handed them back. She was the kind of person you felt you knew way better than you did, from all the times you'd imagined having sex with her.
Do you have anything you want to say about that passage?
Just that.
Gotta use your mic though.
Yeah, that's true. Just that, it didn't occur to me when I was writing this book, but it probably came a little bit out of teaching too. There's something very equalizing about the college class. I mean, you're there with all your friends. They all live in dreams too. You eat the same things. You complain about your parents together. It all seems kind of uniform and level, but of course it's not. And especially, once you teach, you know that there are people there in all kinds of circumstances. And really, he's one of the lucky ones. His mom got him into a life that that he can prosper in. But nonetheless, there's a big cost, and a lot is on his mind and why.
So today I Googled you,
Oh, you did?
which I never do with my friends, but
That's always alarming.
but because I didn't know if I was going to introduce you, someone else was going to introduce you, so I thought I better be prepared. And so I actually Googled you, and I found this New York Times interview with the title, Mona Simpson's fiance promised her to read Middlemarch. He didn't. Now he is her ex.
That's a little deceptive, and actually the fiance is here in the audience. He was actually my husband for many, many years, and now is my dear, dear friend.
Well,
so
and I know him, and he's very dear and very sweet. But I thought
they do take things a bit out of
they had
context.
an amazing quote that certain, from you I assume, as you said, that certain men are constitutionally incapable of reading one of the greatest novels ever written.
I believe I did say that, yes. and I believe I did give many, I believe you're in possession of several different editions of
I've read all your books.
But he's not the only person I've
See the
tried.
problems I cause when I get on Google. This is why I don't Google people.
I know, Google's a problem.
No, I enjoyed that interview very much, and I do recommend it. I just thought it was. First, I just wanted to ask you, why is Middlemarch? So you teach it. It's come up.
I teach it.
numerous
I
times.
mean, it's not the only book I love, of course, but it's up there. It's funny. I was thinking about it today, and I was thinking that it's possible to love a book and think it's probably, up there in the top 3 books in the English language, and yet really wish that she'd had an editor who'd taken out the preface. I think a great portion of the people who start Middlemarch and do not go much further would feel completely differently if they started in chapter 1.
Interesting. All right. Why? Can you tell us why?
It's a very abstract and kind of highfalutin preface. Then you get into chapter 1 and you have these 2 young women. Their parents have been dead for quite a while. They're living with their daughter and uncle. And the one sister wants to take the mother's jewelry out and distribute it among them. And the other sister is a little too ideological and doesn't want to bother with such trifles, but ends up taking the best jewelry anyway. The older sister.
It's always thus. All right. So I was going to talk a little bit about writing, because people like to talk about writing. Writers like to talk about writing. I don't know how many of you know this, but Mona and I are in a writing group together. So we actually meet every couple weeks and we read our work out. Not just the 2 of us, there are other people. And I just thought I would ask you about, I don't know, how do you find, tell me if you enjoyed the writers group, why you enjoy the writers group, how does it help you, how does it hurt you?
I enjoy the writers group. This is a writers group with people who write completely different genres, so it's especially fun. So John, for example, he's a
Have you
member
been in
of-
other writers groups, or is this?
I've been in, I've been in a lot of book clubs. I don't know if I've been in so many writers groups.
You've written a lot of books.
I've written a lot of books. Yes, I have friends. I mean, my friend Ian and I exchange work usually on Fridays. So it's usually been a bit more one-to-one for me.
Yeah.
But I encourage groups because, of course I teach.
Because you teach and you probably put students into groups.
Yes, I put, the big question comes of what happens after the class. So yes, I'm a big believer in groups. Although I'm also a big believer in kind of whatever works for you, and I think different things work for different people. For me, I don't know. I think I love to get a little feedback. I love to have a deadline. So it's anything that will give me a deadline is very, very helpful.
Oh, interesting. But you seem like you have a wonderful work ethic. So tell me about the deadline. You write every day.
I write pretty much every day. I haven't been writing lately, except I've been writing, answers to questions like what books do you have on your night table? And of course,
Right.
what do you say to that?
Middlemarch.
If you start listing your friends, you're going to forget somebody who you love and whose book you love. So that's not a good way to go.
How important do you think it is for a writer to be able to take criticism, and how important is it to be able to ignore criticism?
I think both are very important. I think, first of all, one thing that's really important is to know where the criticism is coming from. I mean, I tell students who write, you know, if they apply to my class writing zombie fiction, I tell them I don't read zombie fiction. And so I'm probably not the best person. I don't even read a whole lot of sci-fi, so I'm not a good critic for that. I can tell if it's working or not, but I can't really necessarily tell you where it falls at all in any kind of context. So I think you better read the work of whoever you're taking criticism from, and decide if you actually share their aesthetic, first of all. But then I think also, to me, I think great suggestions. I mean, my longtime editor, Ann Close, is sitting here, and I had in my, I guess it was my fourth book, in one book I used a voice which I'd heard a lot, which was a voice of an immigrant, which had a lot of inflections and sort of incorrect grammar and had a lot of patois. And I realized that, you know, it was much too thick if the whole book, if there were large sections of that. So my brilliant editor suggested, well, what about if when she's thinking, she thinks in straight lines, in full sentences, but when she's actually speaking in dialogue, and that just opened the book for me. So, I mean, if you find a critic like that, you're very lucky, but they don't grow on trees.
So be selective.
Be selective, and you have to, you know, I think when something feels right, when it absolutely, you know, if you're given a great piece of advice for your work that you're thinking about all the time anyway, there will be a bell that rings.
Will ring true.
I think so.
Ping. Switching back to this topic of this book in particular, you're writing about diction, you're writing about recovery. How much research do you do on that topic, and what kind of research?
Addiction and recovery, well, I teach in an English department, so that research wasn't hard. But no, I know a lot of people who are many, 30, 40, 50 years sober in my department, so it's a topic of conversation that I know a fair bit about. I sometimes wish there were recovery. Sometimes I wish there were recovery groups for those who do not have an addiction. There are other things.
Can you elaborate?
Well, there are other problems we might like to recover from. Depression, malaise, I don't know, you name them. Distraction. Inability to
You want a
concentrate.
recovery group for distraction?
Perhaps. But are you going
You want to get
silent...
all the distractible people together.
Are you going on a silent retreat for 2 weeks? That's probably exactly what
I am going to do that actually for 10 days, and I'm an amateur meditator, so this is going to be either great or a total disaster. Okay, so your last book was Casebook.
Casebook was my last book.
And so you've had a longer gap for this book than for other books. Like you read
I've
a
had
lot.
a longer gap, but yes.
And this one you were telling us took 9 years.
Yes, I didn't realize that. I thought it was 6 years. I think it was 6 years, but then there was COVID and
Sure.
and I have that other book that I'm working on. It's
I just for I mean you're a very productive writer. You write a lot. You write
9
a lot
years
of
is not.
well-respected
I don't
things.
think anyone would say 9 years is exceptionally
But
bad.
it's sort of interesting for a lot of people. It might be kind of heartening, or sometimes it takes longer. But I'm interested in why this took longer. You think?
Well, because this book is sort of an ensemble book. I mean, there's really 5 main characters. There's the mother who is committed, who isn't really. I don't go into her head very often at all, but nonetheless, she's kind of a center and a kind of a looming presence in the book. And then there's her 3 children who are in very different ways figuring out how to cope with the fact that their mother, who was one person for a long time, may not come back and be that person again. And so they're left with trying to make her comfortable and happy as best they can with the new circumstance. And then there's also her friend, who's kind of a friend, a friend she had who the kids didn't even really notice that much. In a funny way, I'm not sure Diane herself noticed this friend as much. I think it was probably one of those a little bit unbalanced friendships, perhaps a romantic friendship really on the friend's part. And the woman's name is Julie. And Julie is a nurse who's lived alone, who hasn't married, who has never had children, and who really looked to Diane, her friend, as the dynamo, as the vibrant one, and followed her on adventures. And Diane got her into trouble. And so she looked forward to talking to her every day. And now this terrible thing has happened to her friend, and her children are in need. So she steps in, and in some ways she's very upset. I mean, I think in many ways Diane was the love of her life, but she's also has this opportunity to really be needed by these kids who do need her, and she's never had that before. So
This might be a good moment for the second half of that reading. What do you think?
sure. And that is, it would be perfect if that was about the character I just spoke of, but it's not. Although she's in it a little bit. Okay, this is just a short little bit. This takes place about a year after Walter, the last section. So the last section, he was thinking about the girl and picturing her naked at night, and now this is a year later, and he's been called home because his mother has been in the hospital. She was doing well. It seemed to be going productively. She seemed to be getting better. But then she had an episode, and his mother's friend Julie calls him down to LA from Berkeley. So here he is going to see his mother in the hospital. She was in a different building now, in an unfamiliar part of the property. The hospital was on a large parcel of land among old trees, but the place today felt ill-built and untended. Even the grass looked poisonous. She was fine before, Walter said. I don't understand. I know it, Julie said. They made their way to the ramshackle building where Julie asked for Walter's mother by her full name. A nurse, preoccupied, pointed them down a hall of polished linoleum. They found her on a cot covered by a sheet, her wrists and calves in worn leather restraints, her ankles swollen, bare feet sticking out. The skin under her eyes appeared bruised. She wouldn't look at Walter. Mom, what happened? He touched her shoulder. Nothing, a small flinch under the skin. She exhaled audibly, then, as if disappointed but not surprised, and shook her head as if everything was too futile to explain. You can tell me, I'm on your side, you know, he said after a while. She shook her head again, stubborn, as if to mean nothing they could do would get it out of her. She kept her eyes on 2 points on the wall. It's Walter, you're Walter, Julie said, in her overtly enunciated whisper that sounded like scolding. He took the bus down from college to see you. The new way Julie talked to his mother made Walter inordinately sad. It went on like this, his mom refusing to look at them until a nurse stepped in and wrote something on a clipboard. Walter asked when the restraints would be taken off. The nurse looked up from her chart with complete dryness, as if he'd asked what time it was. The doctor should have been here already. He's late. He'll come in the next few hours. The next few hours. He's late and he'll be here in the next few hours. Walter didn't know until the end that he'd been shouting. The nurse shrugged. Welcome to hospital time. His mom fell asleep. Julie stood up, rubbing her pants legs. Maybe I'll walk over to her ward and bring something for her to wear tomorrow. I'm antsy. Walter stayed where he was. Surprisingly, this was easy, like settling deep in a hole. It was plain that he needed to sit here and wait. Eventually, the doctor would come. Walter wanted to see him, though he felt furious that he was late. He heard noises, distant and close. Even with her like this, drugged, he liked being next to his mom asleep, hearing her breathe. He took a small book from his backpack. For once, he was exactly where he should be.
Do you have anything you want to say about that passage you just read?
No, not really.
What do you mean when you say the end of institutions? You said.
Basically, Kennedy in 1963, right before he was assassinated, signed a bill called the Mental Health Act of 1963 that basically pulled federal funding from the big state hospitals, which had been for the most part built in the early part of the century or even the 19th century. And his vision was that there would be money funneled to the states to have smaller community-based centers to solve the same problem. Unfortunately, as one of the nurses says in this book, I just took this from one of the nurses that I interviewed, the states got block grants and they could choose what to spend them on. So they could choose between highways and mental health, and they chose highways. So basically, from then on, actually the bill, Kennedy had a lot of reasons for signing that bill. Among them, his sister had a developmentally disabled sister who was given a lobotomy and lived unhappily in an institution for the rest of her life. And this legislation also changed the way that developmentally disabled people were housed and treated, and that actually was better. But there really wasn't a net anymore there isn't a net. Even now, there's very little net for mentally ill patients, and so there's kind of a cycle. I mean, people get picked up on the streets for being homeless, or a lot of the nurses in these institutions speculate that people actually go into a restaurant, order a meal, and don't pay so that they will be arrested, so that they will be put in a psych ward, so that they will get a bed and dinner. So things have definitely deteriorated in that realm, and there are many institutions for which this is the case. I mean, when I was growing up, as I said, there were orphanages, there were homes for incorrigible boys, there were homes for, there were many residential facilities. They weren't all beautiful, and no one does any good by idealizing that particular past. But that's not to say that it should be the Wild West we have right now.
I think we might be about approaching the time we should open for questions, but I've committed the cardinal sin and I don't have a watch.
7:45.
7:45.
Oh,
so
yes,
good,
exactly
perfect.
right.
I've committed the sin, but I have good sense of time. So I think we'll open up for any questions people have. Just raise your hand, I think is probably, and I'll call on people.
And if they're too quiet, we can hand them their mic.
Exactly.
Happily.
Mama wants to get rid of her mic, but she can't. I'll give you mine. And the first one's always hardest.
There's one.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both so much. This is fascinating and terrific. I kind of want to ask about mental health, but I really want to ask, what time of day do you write?
I write now in the morning, first thing, pretty much.
First thing?
Pretty much first thing, because my children are grown up, and so.
Like you wake up, you don't have coffee, you're just
I have
going
coffee.
straight to the computer.
Coffee. I wake up, I have an elaborate, long, sort of fetishistic coffee procedure. And then I go to work. But still kind of in pajamas, usually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll get you a specific answer.
No, I think I like working when other people are asleep, so ideally.
What time do you actually get underway?
Well, actually, I live with someone who gets up really, really early, so it's actually earlier.
Removing the satisfaction of writing while he's asleep because he's awake?
No, he leaves. But I live in Los Angeles, and so people live their whole lives to avoid the traffic. Since I write at home, that's not an issue for me, but I like writing in the mornings. And you can do little things later in the day. Elvin.
I noticed, especially in your second passage, you really get into not just the interiority of the mind, but the body of the person, like down to the way that they're breathing. How often when you're writing are you thinking about the physical body of the character?
That's a really good question. I think an interesting question too would be how many bodies are actually inhabited by men versus women in fiction. I think you'd find that there's probably some disparities there. But I think about that. Novels, you live with these characters for so long. There's very little about them you haven't thought about. It's not that it all gets on the page, but you do, you do sort of get to know them, I think. Jean.
So I'll talk about it.
Okay, cool.
Looking back at your work, are there ideas, themes, situations that strike you in retrospect as sort of being things that you return to? Situations, life issues, kinds of people that you find that you're writing about again and again?
That's a good question. Do you find that, Jean?
That's what I asked.
I guess I do, although, you know, I probably don't see it as much as it's apparent from the outside. I guess I probably do. I think it's changed a little bit as I've gotten older. I found, for example, with this book that, you know, when I was younger, I definitely found it easier to write about women than I did about men. Now I'm writing about a young man and a young woman. They're equally foreign countries and equally kind of accessible to me now, you know, which is nice. That's one of the things about perspective. But I think so. I think you keep doing. I think you kind of do both things. You try to expand your horizons, but there are certain complexes or certain conflicts that continue to attract you, I think.
This half the room has really got to catch up.
I'm over here on the floor. It's me, Lucy.
Oh, hi,
Lucy!
Hi, Mona. I have a question. My question is, how do you get rid of writer's block? How do you move and get out of your head?
That's a hard one. Lucy is a comedian, I should say.
You can tell by her question.
Yes. And does shows in Brooklyn now, I understand. Yeah, you know, I mean, the classic line about writer's block is just, you know, the short of writer's block is lower your standards. And to some extent, I mean, that's true. I'm sort of, I don't do it, but what I tell my students is, you know, if you write every day, there's much less pressure to be brilliant that particular morning, because you could be brilliant tomorrow morning or the day after. You know you're going to do it every day, so it just sort of loosens you up a little. So I guess that's the only thing I can think of, is just work a lot, and then you don't feel as much pressure to. I feel fine. I mean, I throw a lot out. You know, I write a lot and then I throw a lot of it out, and I keep what seems to have some heat to it. Yes.
That segues right into my question, which is, do you find that you have like a slush pile where the things that don't work for a certain project, that you save them to come back to them, and then, you know, or would you really throw them out?
I really throw them out. I take a sort of relish.
That's so
to it.
brave.
I enjoy kind of deciding, no, this doesn't work, out it goes. But sometimes I'll keep something around, and I'm, you know, sometimes it takes some years to figure out what you were doing with something, you know, to put it away for months or years, and then you see it more clearly. It depends how far along. If it's just a little bit of a thing, I'm not that precious about it, keeping it. But if it's a whole draft that's not working and I can't fix it, I'll put it away. And usually at some point in the future, I'll understand what I was trying to do.
We have another one here.
I'm just wondering, because the novel really charts all three of the kids.
Yeah.
At what point did you sort of realize you really needed to, I don't know, write into all three of them rather than maybe focusing on one? Was there a moment where you were like, I think this is, you know, there are three protagonists rather than just one?
Yeah. No, there was definitely with this book. At first I thought it would just sort of be Walter's book, but then I realized his and I didn't, it's not really a Rashomon structure, you know, so that they're not each covering exactly the same events, so it's almost like they pass the baton. So Walter's coming to terms with this in some ways at one period of time, and then his sister makes her accommodations a little bit later, and her little brother finally. So it was also a way for me of covering different periods of time when, you know, in a way, did something
Swap.
it was a way of covering different periods of time. But Walter would have been, settled with his mother, and so it was Donnie's turn.
Obviously you're the creator of your own characters, but do you ever feel like you're discovering things about them or learning who they are as you develop them, or do you always feel like you're actively determining and constructing who they are?
Oh, no, the latter, definitely. I mean, sometimes you try to have them do something and I think there's a point. I think for me, a first draft is really all discovery. It's mostly discovery. And then I kind of, some people outline are very, very fastidious that way. I don't. I sort of write a first draft and then I outline. And then I see what I've got and what I'm going to, where the story is. But I definitely feel like there's a point at which the work starts giving back to you and your characters start asserting themselves and patterns emerge and you see patterns in the work that you hadn't exactly intended. But there they are, and they're sort of unmistakable, so you follow what the characters insist upon, I guess.
Hi, Helen. When do you know that you're done?
Never. Never. In fact, when I was preparing the reading this afternoon, you should see the things I crossed out, the words I changed. I mean, it's just, in fact, we'll be in touch regarding the paper versions. No, I mean, I don't read my old books because I would still be on them. Henry James, at the end of his life, he did a whole new edition of 11 of his novels, and he called them the New York edition, and republished them. And they're different. I mean, it's interesting.
When do you know, because obviously I know your work well, when do you know that a novel is a longer novel, and I know you publish one that's shorter and have another one that's also shorter that feels very rich and covers everything that needs to be covered? When do you know this is going to take 200 pages or this will take 400 pages?
That's a good question.
I've had 30 years to think of it.
Well, suffice it to say, the next one's going to be 200 pages. And I'm happy about that. It makes you... Alice Munro, in an interview, I did an interview for the Paris Review once of Alice Munro, and she said, the great Alice Munro, and she said that when she had kids, she just decided she'd write short stories because it would make more sense, because she could finish things and she could manage it while having kids. And I've never been that able to control my work that way, but I admire that enormously, and I think it's brilliant. And I think if we all had our way, we'd all be writing short stories because it's so pleasing to complete something. But some subjects, some groups of people just seem to have more to resolve, you might say.
Back there? No?
Probably you have time for one or two more. What do you think?
I was actually going to ask about short stories.
Oh, good.
Sorry. But I think you answered already.
Well, we need a last question. We have to squeeze the last question out of this group.
I guess what I wanted to ask is, what do you think a short story can do that a novel can't? And what can a novel do that a short story can't? Besides...
No, that's a good question. I mean, novels are all about time, really. I mean, there's never been a novel that's not about time in some profound way. And short stories are about a moment of illumination and change. And I think there are people who do both brilliantly, but not that many of them. Most of them fall a little bit to one side or the other, I think. And it probably comes down to what you believe. It probably comes down to whether or not you believe in blinding moments of insight, or whether you believe in sort of one step forward and two steps back. It's sort of more incremental change. I think that's my guess about it. But I love short stories. I mean, the greatest pleasure for me to read.
Thank you.
Maybe one more, yeah.
Who do you read for inspiration?
What do I read for inspiration? Oh God, everybody. I read a lot of poetry. I guess, what am I reading now? I was just reading, and I'm reading right now, which is really fun, because I'm doing something for a public space. I'm doing a little thing about To the Lighthouse, and it turns out that My Antonia was published like within that same 10-year period. So I'm reading My Antonia along with To the Lighthouse, which is a fascinating comparison. It's sort of the American female novel and the British female novel. And they couldn't be more different, So that's very inspiring.
Well, what kind of, sorry, just bookseller question real quick. What kind of poets are you reading right now? Because I love that. Sorry. I don't mean to I'm a poet, so I'm like, oh my gosh, what poetry?
Well, Adam Zagajewski died during the pandemic, so I've been doing a deep dive, and I also have his essay collection, which is wonderful.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, is that about, I think that's,
Are we good?
are we good? That's good. That's about time,
Yeah,
right?
we're all good. Thank you so
All right.
much.